I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Oh, that view is tremendous.
It looks beautiful. I feel like $1 million. I'm going to pick up.
6 is about 10 feet above it to the left of 7. We're just flying nose to nose.
During the 1960s and 70s, a dozen astronauts made the stunning odyssey to the moon and back again.
Nearest from here is a grand oasis of the big vastness of space.
It's a nice-looking machine.
So is yours. Columbia, this is Houston, reading you loud and clear, over.
Eagle, you're looking great. Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro. Go. Fido. Go. Guidance. Go. Control. Go. Telcom. Go. GNC. Go. Ecom. Go. Surgeon. Go. Capcom, we're go for landing.
Eagle, Houston, you're a go for landing, over. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
NASA had been responsible for one of the supreme achievements of our time.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Hippity hopping over hill and dale. Hippity hopping along. Ignition. Right away, Houston.
From the early days of Project Mercury and Gemini to the Apollo moon landings, the space agency launched brave men into the heavens and brought them safely home. It all seemed so effortless and so routine. The Can-Do agency had delivered on President Kennedy's bold challenge and inspired a nation. Its conquest of space stood as a symbol of American technological superiority and a testament to the seemingly unlimited capabilities of humanity.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
All of that changed with Challenger.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control program.
Roger, roll,
Challenger.
Challenger now heading down range.
I can't characterize it as an accident at all. It's a disaster, a horrible, terrible disaster, but not an accident, because we could have stopped it. We had initially stopped it, and then that decision was made to go forward anyways.
Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
One minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles. Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
I will never forget where I was when I found out about Challenger. I remember being absolutely stunned by the news. I just couldn't believe it.
Professor Mark Maier is an organizational scholar at the State University of New York at Binghamton. As one of the nation's leading experts on Challenger, he has devoted 5 years of intensive research to the tragedy.
I think it's safe to say at this point that unfortunately this thing really didn't come out of the blue. It was really an accident waiting to happen. You know, as one of the launch officials told me that, and this is a direct quote, we were lucky, just dumbass lucky, you know, that we hadn't had a disaster like this before.
In its final report, issued June 6, 1986, A presidential commission concluded that the disaster was caused by the failure of a rubber O-ring on one of the Challenger's booster rockets to seal properly, due in large part to freezing temperatures before liftoff. But the commission also identified serious flaws in the launch decision-making process and pointed out that this was a disaster waiting to happen, an accident rooted in history.
Once you know the whole story, you know, the tragic bottom line just cries out at you that these 7 people didn't have to die. You know, that this could and it should have been prevented.
The roots of the Challenger disaster can ultimately be traced back to the early 1970s. What could the space agency do that could compare with the dramatic success of its Apollo program? Funds were drying up, and plans for a space station and manned missions to Mars were indefinitely postponed. The reusable space shuttle, originally intended to play a supporting role as space ferry to the station, now was thrust into the spotlight by NASA. Wary of mounting budget deficits fueled by the unpopular Vietnam War, a reluctant Congress and a skeptical Nixon administration were sold by NASA's portrayal of a system so reliable and competitive that it would ultimately be a moneymaker for the government and guarantee jobs for political constituents from coast to coast.
The United States can no longer afford the luxury of the throwaway rocket. Our answer to this challenge is the Space Shuttle, the world's first reusable spacecraft. To get some idea of the savings involved in terms of $1980, it costs about $22 million to put a single satellite into orbit on a Delta launch vehicle. The cost of putting that same satellite up on a shared shuttle mission is between $8 to $12 million, a savings of from $9 to $13 million.
The problems of building a new spacecraft are almost inconceivable in number, and they begin in the process of planning, a process equally as important as the construction itself. Regular telephone conference meetings between the shuttle program management and the contractor have improved communications and helped reduce travel. Tiny, persistent, seemingly insignificant problems must be resolved in a slow but necessary process to prevent or resolve larger, more significant problems.
The Space Shuttle is about to enter its orbital flight test phase. Once this is completed, the shuttle will begin operational missions. The users are standing by. Space in the payload bay has been reserved for the first 3 years of operation by the United States and foreign government agencies.
The reusable space shuttle vehicles are designed to fly up to 60 missions a year. They will be launched like a rocket and land like an airplane.
The shuttle program was almost made up out of the whole cloth. There is nothing in its original specifications that has come anywhere near reality and performance.
Robert Holtz was editor of Aviation Week and Space Technology and a member of the Presidential Commission which investigated the tragedy.
They had the illusion that the shuttle would be a space airliner, a cargo truck with a regularity and economy that time has proved was a grand illusion.
The stage is set for a new era in spaceflight for NASA, STS, the Space Transport System.
Breakers closed. 5, 4, we've gone for main engine start. We have.
It is the first of 4 orbital test flights for the shuttle. A marvel of scientific achievement, the Columbia is launched again. And again. And again. The STS-4 mission is sent on an extra orbit so the President can arrive in time for the landing at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Thousands are on hand to celebrate the occasion.
Than the typical 4th of July fireworks display could ever hope to equal. The 4th landing of Space Shuttle Columbia, world's first reusable spacecraft. Columbia's first landing on a concrete runway, officially ending the orbital flight test program. Takeoff of the second orbiter in the shuttle fleet, Challenger, on its ferry flight to Kennedy Space Center, Florida, to be launched into space in the early part of 1983. And with Shuttle Pathfinder Enterprise as backdrop, the announcement of America's new space policy by President Ronald Reagan.
Beginning with the next flight, the Columbia and her sister ships will be fully operational, ready to provide economical and routine access to space for scientific exploration, commercial ventures, and for tasks related to the national security. We've only peered over the edge of our accomplishment.
Looking back at that spectacular event and the performance of Space Shuttle during its first 4 flights, there seems little doubt now that it is a reliable, reusable space transportation system. It is projected that by the mid-'80s, there will be 2 shuttle launches per month. Only the shuttle has that capability. It meets a need, providing access to low Earth orbit on a routine basis. By launching on time, serving as a platform for Earth observation.
And there was also a political dimension to it as well, because the shuttle had been sold as a reliable space truck.
Richard Cook was a program analyst in the budget office at NASA headquarters at the time of the Challenger disaster.
And it had been declared back in 1982 a fully operational system. The White House was treating it as a fully operational system that was going to fly all U.S. space launches eventually. And there was just a whole party line and propaganda that the thing was a completely understood, completely reliable vehicle, and it wasn't.
We have a go for main engine start. 5, we have main engine start. We have a cutoff.
NTD, we have an RSO on board.
We have an abort by the onboard computers of the orbiter Discovery.
Launches were increasingly predictably delayed. In 1983 and 84, a total of only 9 missions were flown. The space airline air cargo image which NASA had worked so hard to cultivate was a mirage. The agency had grossly underestimated the technological complexity of flying a space shuttle and overestimated its ability to surmount any technological problems which arose in the process.
Liftoff of STS-7.
Particularly troublesome was the alarming discovery, as early as the second mission, that critical rubber seals in the rocket boosters were eroding in flight. A danger which, in fact, had been predicted by NASA engineers years earlier, evidence of a fatal design flaw.
25 seconds, roll maneuver completed.
In 1973, when the contracts for the shuttle had been announced, Rockwell International was selected to design and build the orbiter fleet. And Thiokol, due principally to what NASA called its sizable cost advantage, beat out 4 competitors for the contract to develop the reusable rockets which would propel the shuttle into orbit. Thiokol had been ranked lowest in actual engineering design. The key concern with the Thiokol proposal centered on the so-called field joints of the twin solid rocket fuel boosters, designed to be reused up to 20 times. The booster is actually a stack of 4 massive interlocking cylinders, each 12 feet wide and over 25 feet tall. These giant rocket segments are loaded with solid propellant and shipped to the Kennedy Space Center, where they are assembled in the field. Hence the name field joint. The so-called tang of the upper segment slides into the groove or clevis of the lower segment. During ignition, the solid fuel inside burns with explosive pressure. In order to prevent the hot combustion gases from leaking out, each joint is sealed by 2 synthetic rubber O-rings, each about 1/4 of an inch thick and about 12 feet in diameter, the same diameter as the booster. In theory, the first, or primary O-ring, is supposed to seal the joint. Thiokol claimed the second O-ring was a redundant feature, a fail-safe, there to serve as a backup in case the primary seal should fail. After a 2-minute burn, the boosters are jettisoned and parachuted to the ocean. They are then recovered and towed back to the Kennedy Space Center for disassembly and damage assessment by an engineering team from Thiokol. Following inspection, the segments are shipped back to Thiokol in Utah, where they are fitted with new O-rings, reloaded with solid rocket fuel, and sent back to Kennedy for use on a subsequent mission. Recovery and inspection of the boosters revealed that, in actual practice, the joints were not sealing properly. When the rockets were ignited at blastoff, a phenomenon called joint rotation occurred. In the fraction of a second it takes for the boosters to become pressurized, each segment of the solid rocket bulges like frozen cans of soda. Because the rocket is stiffer at the joints than at the segment midsections, the tang and clevis in the joint rotate. They move relative to each other. But instead of moving toward one another and sealing as the Thiokol designers had expected, the tang and the clevis bent away from one another, precisely as predicted years earlier by NASA's own engineers at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. In this 1979 memo, senior NASA rocket engineer John Miller condemned the Thiokol design as completely unacceptable. Miller's tests revealed that the opening of the joint was causing the primary O-ring seal to extrude into the gap, forcing it to function in a way which violated industry and government specifications. Miller protested that the excessive tang-clevis relative movement also allows the secondary O-ring to become completely disengaged from its sealing surface. In essence, there was no reliable backup if the primary O-ring should ever fail. NASA eventually conceded this, and in late 1982, officially reclassified the joint from Criticality 1R for redundant to Criticality 1. Failure effect, loss of mission, vehicle, and crew due to probable case burst, resulting in fire and deflagration. The reclassification had little apparent effect on either NASA or Thiokol, however. NASA managers, even up to and through the presidential investigation, would refer to the troublesome opening of the joint as an extrusion gap and insist that the secondary seal was indeed a redundant failsafe under all but the worst of conditions, even though no such conditions were specified in the critical items list. Flights and the consequent escalation of risk would continue unabated.
165 feet, 116 feet, lock, touchdown.
January 24th, 1985. Discovery lifts off on mission 51C, the 15th flight of the shuttle program. At the time, it is the coldest launch on record. The air temperature at liftoff is 53 degrees.
In January 1985, I was sent down to the Cape to give a presentation on the sensitivity and the design features of the joints. And while I was there, I was tasked to inspect the hardware as it was recovered from the Atlantic Ocean, as I had done in the past, and then report my findings back, which became incorporated into the flight readiness review system for the next flights.
Roger Boisjoly was a rocket engineer at Morton Thiokol and its top expert on the booster field joints.
I discovered that the two joints in that vehicle contained massive hot gas blow-by, and by massive I mean on a 12-foot diameter cylinder, 110 degrees and 80 degrees of arc length, which means, if you put it in layman's terms, you couldn't encompass the amount of damage by spreading your arms in trying to do so. It was much, much more than we had ever seen before.
So this was, what was your reaction to that?
One of absolute amazement that we had not had a disaster at that point in time, because we were very fortunate with that amount of gas getting past the primary seal that the secondary seal sealed it off and it worked just fine.
The O-ring problem escalated after Mission 51B, launched on April 29, 1985. In May of 1985, Boisjoly and his team inspected a nozzle joint in the booster and were shocked to discover a new phenomenon, erosion of a secondary seal. It was the worst seal failure yet. 2/3 of the secondary O-ring had been eaten away.
And to our utter amazement, we found the primary seal destroyed in that joint. And we postulated that it hadn't sealed for the first 2 minutes, the full 2 minutes of booster flight. And that really escalated the concerns, because if that scenario, whatever it was that caused that, ever occurred in a field joint, then we could have lost the flight under normal room temperature launch conditions, because that was not a low temperature launch.
Back in Utah, Boisjoly's discovery prompted him to deliver a blistering memo to the Vice President of Engineering, Bob Lund, in which he openly criticized his company and NASA's mistakenly accepted position to fly without fear of failure.
And I stated, this letter is written to ensure that management is fully aware of the seriousness of the current O-ring erosion problem in the solid rocket motor joints from an engineering standpoint. And I said, if the same scenario should occur in a field joint, and it could, then it is a jump ball as to the success or failure of the joint, because the secondary O-ring cannot respond to the crevice opening rate and may not be capable of pressurization. The result would be a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. And I ended it by saying, it is my honest and very real fear that if we do not take immediate action to dedicate a team to solve the problem with the field joints having the number one priority, then we stand in jeopardy of losing a flight along with all the launch pad facilities. And then I signed it, and it was concurred to by my supervisor.
To control its distribution, Boisjoly's memo was stamped Company Private and never reached NASA. It did, however, prompt the formation of a special SEAL task force at Thiokol to examine ways of fixing the joint. Unknown to Boisjoly, similar concerns were also being raised at this time within the space agency itself.
I was quite surprised to find that Richard Cook had written, or anybody for that matter, had written memos in the same light that I had, because I felt that it was an internally almost unofficial secret, if you will, even though the agency knew about it, NASA, the agency, knew about it.
At NASA headquarters in Washington, Richard Cook had just taken on his position as a budget analyst for the agency. As one of his first assignments, his supervisor asked him to visit the Office of Spaceflight and interview headquarters engineers about the O-ring problem and assess its potential budgetary impact.
We talked for a while about what could happen during a flight, and a lot of it was couched in kind of technical language. And I said, well, what happens if these O-rings fail? And they said, rather quietly, well, the thing could blow up. And they added, I didn't put it in the memo, but they added that they literally held their breath every time the shuttle went up because of this. They also said they were working on the solution to it, try to find out what could be done to correct the problem. But it was clear that shuttle missions were continuing and would go on while this problem was being studied.
In his July 23rd memo, Cook paraphrased what the engineers had told him, indicating the O-ring situation was a potentially major problem affecting both flight safety and program costs, and offered this chilling assessment.
I said that the safety of the shuttle was being compromised by the O-ring situation, and that failure during flight would certainly be catastrophic. And then later on in the memo, I pointed out that from a budgetary standpoint, it was being viewed as a very serious problem by spaceflight management, because if the shuttle had to be grounded to re-engineer the O-rings. It could suspend flights for some time, and it would be very expensive to do that.
The near catastrophe on the April flight had gotten the attention of NASA headquarters. A full-scale briefing was scheduled to bring top officials up to date on all aspects of the O-ring erosion problems, including failure history, current status, and options for correction. The briefing took place on August 19th.
The key event in 1985 in terms of NASA's decision process about the O-rings was the August 19th briefing where Thiokol and Marshall came in to headquarters and presented their proposals for the quick fix on the O-ring joint, and along with the recommendation that flights continue while the repair was being made.
Among those attending the briefing are Larry Malloy, the solid rocket booster manager at the Marshall Space Flight Center, and Alan McDonald, representing Morton Thiokol, along with senior managers Jerry Mason and Joe Kilminster.
All of the people who really should have been there were not. Jesse Moore, who was the head of the Office of Spaceflight, was not present. He was at other meetings concerned with the shuttle main engines, and so the meeting was conducted by his deputy, Mike Weeks. As important, the Houston program office, headed by Arnie Aldrich, was not invited to or represented at this meeting. Now that's a real key because Houston, of course, is the home of the astronaut office, and so the astronauts did not have an opportunity to hear what was being said about the O-rings and to get the full flavor of the concern. My own opinion is that the exclusion of Houston from this meeting was probably deliberate, because had the astronauts gotten wind of the problem, they had enough influence where they might have made an attempt to halt flights. Now, Thiokol and Marshall went through the briefing, presented the data, including their proposed quick fix, and the meeting ended with a decision that flights would continue.
56 charts were presented by Alan McDonald on behalf of Thiokol. Marshall and Thiokol brought headquarters, Level 1, up to date on the O-ring erosion problems. Although resiliency, reduced sealing capability at lower temperatures, was addressed as the #1 issue, there were some notable omissions from the Thiokol presentation.
The cold temperature issue had been going on, being worked in Thiokol and Marshall all during that year. And as a matter of fact, there was a slide that was presented or prepared for that briefing that pointed out very emphatically that cold temperatures aggravate the O-ring problem. But I'm told that slide, which we have copies of, was deleted from the presentation by Marshall down in Huntsville before Thiokol went up to make the presentation at Washington.
It wasn't the first time that Marshall had withheld unpleasant information from its superiors in the NASA hierarchy, information which could threaten the prevailing can-do ideology of the agency. Nor would it be the last.
It's really all too common for information to get distorted as it makes its way up the organizational chain, usually to reflect the interests of the receiver. In this particular case, any voice that might challenge the official NASA ideology that it could accomplish anything as it roared ahead towards 24 flights a year would be interpreted as the voice of disloyalty. Bureaucratic structures place tremendous pressures on individuals to tell their bosses what they want to hear, which is not necessarily what they need to know.
According to Mike Weeks, after the briefing, he phoned down to Marshall, and he talked to George Hardy, who formerly had headed the solid rocket booster program, but by now was the deputy head of the entire engineering directorate. And he asked Mr. Hardy, how bad is it? Should we stop? And Hardy said, no, we think it's going to be okay. We can continue to fly.
That briefing was given on the 19th of August, and then Mr. Weeks came back a day later or 2 days later and reported back to me that he had heard the briefing and that he thought the data basically supported continuing to fly. He did not think it was an issue that we ought to ground the fleet. We did.
The final decision to go with the O-ring problems was a headquarters decision made with incomplete information, without the participation of very key players, including Houston and the astronauts, and without, as far as I'm aware, the direct recommendations of the top headquarters engineers who had the concerns about the safety of the shuttle. And they just made a major mistake in thinking they could continue to fly while the repair was underway.
Although Thiokol and Marshall had withheld vital information from the key decision makers, the commission which investigated the shuttle disaster would conclude nonetheless that the briefing was sufficiently detailed to require corrective action before the next flight. No correction was made, according to a congressional investigation of the tragedy, because meeting flight schedules and cutting costs were given a higher priority than flight safety. Headquarters had given the joint its seal of approval. Continue to fly as is and fix it as we go along.
They'd been launching spacecraft for 20 years, and I don't think they believed that they were going to blow one up. And they thought, at least at the management level, that they could get away with it.
During the Apollo years, safety had been the hallmark of NASA, but the unrelenting pressure to meet an accelerating flight schedule steadily eroded that stance to the point where the Commission would chastise the space agency's silent safety program. No one was willing to denounce the established flight rates as unrealistic. No one was willing to stop the flights.
We have ignition, we have liftoff of Columbia.
You aren't going to find an engineer with 20 years experience and a livelihood to protect stand up and say, excuse me, but we might have an explosion on the next shuttle flight because the O-rings might break. It's just not going to happen. If someone did get up, he would quickly be branded a naysayer. I never said a word in those meetings. I was a nobody, more junior than the veteran engineers. And there was always the nagging thought in the engineers' minds that, gee, we may be wrong. Maybe nothing will happen.
To stop the flights, it takes an inordinate amount of courage, intestinal fortitude, because you will all of a sudden be the focal point of all the wrath for stopping the space program. And I really believe that's the bottom line as to why no single individual was able to come forth, even if they had the authority to do so, because it would be almost tantamount to terminating one's career because you would have been branded as stopping the space program.
President Reagan's 1982 announcement that STS was operational had frozen the design of the shuttle and funds for design-related expenditures. Money for testing and development on the shuttle was going down at the same time that the flight rate was going up. More was being expected out of the shuttle for less. Instead of alerting officials to the fact that the booster design was unsafe under any and all conditions, the increasing incidence of erosion during 1984 and 1985 instead desensitized them to its danger. They began to officially speak of it first as allowable. And when hot gases blew by the O-rings in 2 field joints on the January 85 launch and the seals held anyway, they mistakenly concluded that they were evidently operating in a region of acceptable risk. As Presidential Commissioner Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, later observed,
and so you decide what risk to accept. And I've read all these reviews. And they agonize whether they can go, even though they had some blow-by in the seal, or they had a cracked blade in the pump of one of the engines, whether they can go the next time, or this time, and they decide yes. Then it flies, and nothing happens. Then it is suggested, therefore, that that risk is no longer so high. For the next flight, we can lower our standards a little bit because we got away with it last time. If you watch the criteria of how much blow-by you're going to accept, or how many cracks, or how long the thing goes between cracks, you'll find that the time is always decreasing, and an argument is always given that last time it worked. It's a kind of Russian roulette. You got away with it, there was a risk, you got away with it, but it shouldn't be done over and over again like that. And when I look at the reviews, I find the perpetual movement heading for trouble.
Commenting on launch schedule pressure in an interview following the disaster, Larry Malloy, NASA's manager for the solid rocket boosters, explained, "That can't help but influence the degree of risk that one would take. But to me, that is a self-imposed thing. You make a commitment and you try your damnedest to meet it. It's probably self-imposed professional pride, doing what you by God said you were going to do." According to the Commission, the problem with the faulty joint spiraled out of control because, quote, both NASA and contractor management, Thiokol, first failed to recognize it as a problem, then failed to fix it, and finally treated it as an acceptable flight risk, unquote. NASA had committed itself irreversibly to its course, a course with an inevitable, if tragic, outcome.
7, 6, we have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1.
In response to Roger Boisjoly's July memo, a SEAL task force had been established at Thiokol to find a solution to the O-ring problem. By October, it became clear to members of the task force that the team was a paper tiger with no real clout.
We became very exacerbated with the lack of progress that was being made and the lack of support being given to us. And so we went.
They decided that a coordinated effort was necessary to get the attention of the organization. Task Force member Stuart Stein expressed his frustration about the lack of potency of the O-ring task force to Thiokol's Vice President of Engineering, Bob Lund. Stein pointed out that the task force was being hog-tied by paperwork and complained that if Thiokol did not invest the team with real authority, the task force would never have the potency necessary to resolve the problems in a timely manner. Bob Ebling, the chair of the task force, wrote a similar but more desperate appeal to Al McDonald, the director of the Solid Rocket Motor Project for Thiokol. He began his memo with a simple and soulful plea: help. Charging that the SEAL task force was being delayed by every possible means, Ebling accused Thiokol personnel of not cooperating with the task force and lamented, "We wish we could get action by verbal request, but such is not the case." His memo ended with a dramatic appeal for his managers to take notice. This is a red flag. It was a highly unusual memo prompted by, unfortunately, all too familiar circumstances. On October 3, 1985, Joe Kilminster, Thiokol's vice president for the Space Booster program, agreed to meet with the task force and let them voice their concerns. The outcome only further aggravated the frustrations of the rocket engineers.
You wrote an activity report on the 4th of October that characterized some of this. Could you summarize some of the things you said in that activity report, the key points, please?
The team generally has been experiencing trouble from the business-as-usual attitude from supporting organizations. Part of this is due to lack of understanding of how important this task team activity is, and the rest is due to pure operating procedure inertia, which prevents timely results to a specific request. The team met with Joe Kilminster on 10/3/85 to discuss this problem. He wanted specific examples, which he was given, and he simply concluded that it was every team member's responsibility to flag problems that occurred to organizational supervision and to work to remove the roadblock by getting the required support to solve the problem. The problem was further explained to require almost full-time nursing of each task to ensure that it is taken to completion by a support group. Joe simply agreed and said we should then nurse every task we have. He plain doesn't understand that there are not enough people to do that kind of nursing of each task, but he doesn't seem to mind directing that the task nevertheless gets done. I, for one, resent working at full capacity all week long and then being required to support activity on the weekend that could have been accomplished during the week. I might add that even NASA perceives that the team is being blocked in its engineering efforts to accomplish its tasks. NASA is sending an engineering representative to stay with us starting October the 14th. We feel that this is the direct result of their feeling that we, MTI, are not responding quickly enough on the seal problem. Finally, the basic problem boils down to the fact that all MTI problems have #1 priority, and that upper management apparently feels that the SRM program is ours for sure and the customer be damned. And I signed it October 4, 1985.
No one really understood thoroughly why the O-rings were failing, and various things were being done to solve the problem. But flights were not stopped, mainly because nothing was going to stop shuttle flights, unless there was probably a catastrophe.
We have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Control program. Roger, roll, Challenger.
We have ignition, we have liftoff.
By the fall of 1985, despite severe warnings raised within both organizations, NASA and Morton Thiokol management had agreed that damage to the rubber O-ring seals in the shuttle's rocket boosters was an acceptable flight risk, even though NASA's official Criticality 1 rating on the joint recognized that a failure of the primary O-ring could be catastrophic. Efforts by Roger Boisjoly and a special SEAL task force at Morton Thiokol, and by Richard Cook at NASA headquarters to alert their organizations to the dangers of continued flight were overwhelmed by economic considerations and socio-political pressures to meet an accelerating flight schedule. These historical routes made what was about to happen to the Challenger virtually inevitable. Between October and the following January, 3 more flights occurred. Record delays on the January 12th mission of the Columbia had already forced the postponement of the Challenger launch to January 26th. The crew for Flight 51L arrived at the Cape on January 23, 1986. They were anxious and ready to fly.
As usual, it's a real pleasure to be at the Cape, to come down here and participate in something that the Cape does better than anybody in the world, and that's launching space vehicles.
It's good to be down here and to be flying a vehicle that we know a lot of folks down here have worked very hard on. We understand it's ready to go, and we're looking forward to going to fly.
I am hoping that the affliction that Steve Hawley had from the 41D mission specialist of the delays hasn't rubbed off on me, and I think the guys behind me are hoping that it hasn't also. Otherwise, they might throw me off the flight.
I had the privilege of being a part of the crew a couple of years ago that made the first landing here at the Cape, and I intend to be a part of the crew to make the first return landing to the Cape in about a week. At this time, I'd like to introduce you to perhaps the person you came to see, and that's Krista McAuliffe, our payload specialist, teacher in space.
Well, I am so excited to be here. We watched Columbia go over the Houston area this morning, and that was a thrill. I don't think any teacher has ever been more ready to have 2 lessons in my life. I've been preparing these since September, and I just hope everybody tunes in on day 4 now to watch the teacher teaching from space.
Mission 51L was designed to be extraordinary from the start. New Hampshire school teacher Krista McAuliffe had been handpicked by President Reagan from among 142 applicants to become America's first civilian in space.
The Teacher in Space program was a presidential initiative that originated in the 1984 presidential campaign and was in fact very closely followed by President Reagan. And Krista McAuliffe herself was designated the Teacher in Space at a White House ceremony that was presided over by the Vice President George Bush.
Her presence had sparked an excitement in spaceflight among a media and a public grown bored with the seemingly routine orbiter missions.
The White House was very interested in the Teacher in Space project as it proceeded through NASA, and as disclosed in the archives, there was time set aside during the Day 4 broadcast for the President to phone the shuttle and, as part of this nationwide program, to have a phone conversation with Krista McAuliffe and the other astronauts.
For a president who relied heavily on the power of television to establish his image as the great communicator, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. Reagan's annual State of the Union address was scheduled for Tuesday, January 28th, and a launch on or before that date would guarantee that McAuliffe's lesson from space would fall on a school day.
Good morning. This is Krista McAuliffe, live from the Challenger. And since I'm talking about why we're in space and why it's important that other people get a chance to fly in space.
Before McAuliffe could get that chance, however, she and her crewmates would have to wait even longer than anticipated. A combination of bad weather and technical glitches imposed additional delays, first to the 27th, then to the 28th. The reaction of the media was quick and predictable. Dan Rather on the CBS Evening News remarked, "Yet another costly, red faces all around space shuttle launch delay." ABC's World News Tonight taunted, "Once again, a flawless liftoff proved too much of a challenge for Challenger." Even as the launch was being postponed on Monday, another potential setback literally loomed on the horizon. A cold front was moving in, and the forecast called for freezing overnight lows. As the countdown to liftoff continued, the predicted temperature for launch the next morning was 29 degrees, far, far below any previous launch.
We had received word within Morton Thiokol that the expected overnight low was to be 18 degrees Fahrenheit. I personally found out about that about noontime, and a meeting was convened by Bob Ebling that had the members of the SEAL task force team present, plus some other engineers who were concerned with the problem. And we discussed the potentials of danger at launching at such a low temperature. And then we reconvened that meeting in the Vice President of Engineers office at Morton Thiokol and added some middle managers along with us. And those discussions went on, and everybody was in agreement that we should make an attempt to stop the launch at that point if that temperature materialized.
A telephone conference was convened on the afternoon of the 27th by NASA's Stanley Reinhardt to assess the possible effects of the cold.
All the preliminary discussions that took place that day were leading towards not flying under such adverse conditions, or at least postponing until conditions got better.
So after listening to the verbal presentation in the afternoon, they asked what Thiokol's position was, and I looked around the room, and I was a senior person, and I said, I don't want to fly. Looks to me, the story says that 53 degrees is about it. And of course, we were requested then to go back and do something more and prepare detailed charts and to show that in more detail.
Reinhardt asks Thiokol to assemble its information and fax it to Kennedy and the Marshall Space Flight Center for a fuller evaluation in a three-way telephone conference call, or Telecon, later that evening. His deputy, Judson Lovingood, recommends he notify higher-ups at Level 2 of the probable delay.
After completing that telecon and making the, and everyone agreeing to meet at certain locations and have the subsequent telecon that evening, I called Stan at the motel, and I suggested to him that he go ahead and alert Arnie at that point.
Arnie being?
Arnie Aldridge, at that point, that we were having that meeting. We were going to get together within the center and decide what to do, and then prepare Arnie for getting Level 1 together and then going on up the line. But what I was looking at then was, I was thinking that there was a good possibility of a launch delay.
Good possibility of what?
Of a launch delay.
Aldrich is the next ranking official in the launch chain of command, operating out of the Level 2 Johnson Space Center in Houston, site of the astronauts' office. Reluctant to be the bearer of bad news, however, Reinhartz ignores Lovingood's suggestion and decides to await the results of the evening telecon. The momentum for launch had begun. In the late afternoon, Reinhartz returns to the Holiday Inn on Merritt Island and meets with the other Marshall Center managers to discuss the impending no-launch recommendation. Joining Reinhartz at the motel are Larry Malloy, the project manager for solid rocket boosters at Marshall, James Kingsbury, the overall director of science and engineering, and William Lucas, the iron-willed controlling director of the Marshall Space Flight Center and Reinhardtz's direct superior. According to investigative reporter Malcolm McConnell's groundbreaking analysis of Challenger, one reliable NASA source, identified only as Apocalypse, revealed that Lucas staked his personal reputation on Marshall's performance. According to the source, Lucas had consistently made it clear to his managers that, quote, "Under no circumstances is Marshall to be the cause for delaying a launch," unquote.
This Marshall team was willing to work with a singleness of purpose and with a determination to complete whatever job was necessary to achieve a goal.
In the early evening hours of January 27th, here in one of these rooms, Lucas and his subordinates met to consider the implications of the Thiokol position.
I personally believe that at the motel room, some indication had to have been given by Lucas to Malloy that somebody had made a decision the launch was a go, and that your job was to see that it happened.
During the final telecon, Thiokol, as expected, would initially recommend against the launch, but ultimately reverse themselves under pressure from NASA. The decision-making process, according to the presidential investigation, was seriously flawed. That evening, as predicted, the temperatures dropped below freezing. The temperature at the joint was measured to be 8 degrees. It was not reported. Under the system, it was not required. The crew of the Challenger departed for the launch pad unaware of the discussions which took place the night before and oblivious to the dangers ahead. The temperature at 11:38 a.m. liftoff was 38 degrees,
T-minus 10.
15 degrees colder than any previous launch.
We have main engine
At the
start.
precise moment of ignition, the rocket joints flex, and both O-rings, hopelessly compromised and hardened by the cold, separate from their sealing surface. They are vaporized as the hot gases burn through. Only a fragile seal, formed by the products of combustion, stops the leak and keeps Challenger from blowing up on the pad. The shuttle is on its final voyage. 60 seconds later, the fragile seal would shatter. Unbeknownst to flight controllers on the ground, the escaping gases burn away at the external fuel tank like a giant blowtorch. The fuel tank ruptures, breaking the orbiter into pieces. The crew compartment hurtles intact out of the vapor cloud, its precious human cargo still on board. The 7 astronauts survive the breakup, but perish when their flight deck slams into the Atlantic nearly 3 minutes later. Most people, including the Presidential Commission investigating the resulting tragedy, still refer to it as the Challenger accident.
I can't characterize it as an accident at all. It's a disaster, a horrible, terrible disaster, but not an accident, because We could have stopped it. We had initially stopped it, and then that decision was made to go forward anyways.
That decision was made during the final telephone conference call, which began at 8:45 p.m. the night before the launch. The telecon that would seal Challenger's fate began at 8:45 p.m. on January 27th. For over 1 hour, Thiokol engineers, led by Roger Boisjoly, presented data suggesting that, because of the cold weather, the rubber O-rings would be harder than usual and therefore might not be capable of sealing the joint opening quickly enough.
And what that really means, basically, is that the harder the material is, it would be likened to trying to shove a brick into a crack versus a sponge. These are the sum and substance of what I just presented. If action time increases, then the threshold of secondary seal pressurization capability is approached. That was my fear. If the threshold is reached, then secondary seal may not be capable of being pressurized. And that was the bottom line of everything that had been presented up to that point. So from an erosion standpoint, I think it is fair to say that there was indeed sufficient margin. But that was not the issue. Erosion was not the issue. What was the issue is, can you stand a longer period of time in an attempt to seal before the erosion eats you alive and you don't have a seal period?
The Thiokol engineers were stating that they believe the effect of that lower temperature on the O-rings would be to slow the time for the primary O-ring to seal, resulting in greater hot gas past the primary seal and possibly erosion of the secondary seal. The data that they showed included the previous coldest launch, which was STS-51C, which they stated, at least qualitatively, had the worst blow-by of any previously observed. Considerable discussion between Marshall and Thiokol on the significance of those data then ensued. There was, at that time, we still didn't have conclusion and recommendation charts. All we were trying to do was understand what the data were telling us.
I was asked, at that point in time, I was asked to quantify my concerns. And I said I couldn't. I couldn't quantify it. I had no data to quantify it, but I did say I knew that it was away from goodness in the current database. Someone on the net commented that we had soot blow-by on SRM-22, which was launched at 75 degrees. I don't remember who made the comment, but that's where the first comment came in about the disparity between my conclusion and the observed data, because SRM-22 had blow-by at essentially a room temperature launch.
I guess one of the big things is that we really didn't know whether temperature was the driver or not. We couldn't tell. We had hot motors that blew by and cold motors that blew by, and some very near either end that did not. The data was inconclusive. So I had trouble justifying in my own mind and saying, by golly, temperature is a factor.
I was asked again for data to support my claim, and I said I have none other than what is being presented, and I had been trying to get resiliency data, Arnie and I both, since last October. And that statement was mentioned on the net. Others in the room presented their charts, and the main telecon session concluded with Bob Lund, who was our Vice President of Engineering, presenting his conclusions and recommendations charts, which were based on our data input up to that point.
And so we stood at the whiteboard there in the Management Information Center, and as the data would come in, we would try and say, now what does this tell us, what does this tell us, and put together a rationale for what we wanted to do. So it was in a real-time mode, and we were trying to absorb the data and put together the story. Well, as a result of that telecon, I gave the charts that made the recommendation that we wait until the motor got to 53 degrees. I didn't see anything different that I hadn't seen before. And, of course, you've heard the story of what happened after that.
Listeners on the telecon were not pleased with the conclusions and the recommendations.
What was the conclusion?
The conclusions were that we should not fly outside of our database, which was 53 degrees. Those were the conclusions. And we were quite pleased because we knew in advance, having participated in the preparation, what the conclusions were, and we felt very comfortable with that.
That was the very definite question of conservatism. You know, this program has people on it, so I'm very concerned about that. And I want to make sure that if there's any hint of a problem, that we're not extending that. We didn't have any data at that point that would indicate that we should go beyond that.
About halfway through, after we had looked at all the data, the conclusion and recommendation charts that Mr. Lund had prepared came in. And the logic for his recommendation, which did not specifically address don't launch 51L, what it said was that within our experience base, we should not operate any solid rocket motor at any temperature colder than we have previously operated one, which was 51C.
Well, didn't you take that to be a negative?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. That was an engineering conclusion, which I found this conclusion without basis, and I challenged its logic.
Right after we stopped, our managers were asked for their launch decision. Joe Kilminster responded that he did not recommend launching based on the engineering presentation just made. That's the first no vote. Count them. Count them so you really understand what happened.
I asked Mr. Kilminster then, who is the Vice President of Space Booster Projects, for his recommendation for 51L. He stated that based on the engineering recommendation, he could not recommend launch. Now, I fully understood what Mr. Kilminster was saying at that time. He did not say the engineering data says that you can't launch. He says, I've got an engineering recommendation here, and based on that, I certainly cannot recommend launch. This was a rather surprising conclusion based on data that didn't seem to hang together. So I challenged that.
For the first time in the entire history of spaceflight, a contractor's recommendation not to launch was being challenged. It was clear to the Thiokol engineers that they were not telling NASA what it wanted to hear.
Larry Malloy then asked George Hardy at the Marshall Space Flight Center for his launch decision. George Hardy was like the chief engineer at the center. George responded that he was appalled by Thiokol's recommendation, but he would not recommend launching over the contractor's objection. That's the second no vote.
And so we got ourselves in the thought process that we were trying to find some way to prove to them it wouldn't work, and we were unable to do that. We couldn't prove absolutely that motor wouldn't work.
Thereafter, NASA, in one way or another, made it clear that they were displeased with that recommendation. And I assume that you knew when you made the recommendation that your recommendation, in fact, was going to determine whether that shuttle would be launched or not, because NASA had indicated to you they would not fly unless they had a written report from Thiokol saying you approved the launch.
I didn't know that NASA would accept that.
You didn't know that?
No, I didn't.
Well, you must have known your recommendation was very important. You knew that if you voted against the launch, it would not have been launched, didn't you?
Well, we had voted prior to it, and they didn't accept it, so I couldn't forecast what NASA would do.
No, but you knew that that was the reason they asked you to reconsider. That's why you had the 5-minute recess, didn't you?
That's a fair statement, yes.
Then Larry Malloy went into a summary mode, and that's when he made his statements that started, actually reinforced the creation of pressure. George Hardy actually started the pressure when he said he was appalled. You have to understand George Hardy was a highly respected manager and engineer in the program and worked for many, many years. And when George Hardy says he's appalled, people sit up straight in the chair and take notice. And that was the beginning of the pressure. Larry Malloy just escalated the pressure with comments like, my God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch, next April? Or why are you guys trying to come up with launch commit criteria on the eve of the launch?
The total context, I think, in which those words may have been used is, there are currently no launch commit criteria for joint temperature. What you are proposing to do is to generate a new launch commit criteria on the eve of a launch after we have successfully flown with the existing launch commit criteria 24 previous times. With this LCC, i.e., do not launch with a temperature greater than 53 degrees, we may not be able to launch until next April. We need to consider this carefully before we jump to any such conclusions. It's all in context, again, with challenging, I think, your interpretation of the data. What does it mean, and is it logical? Is it truly logical that we really have a system that has to be 53 degrees to fly? Now, that has been interpreted by some people as applying pressure. I certainly don't consider it to be applying pressure. Anytime that one of my contractors, or for that matter, some of Mr. Hardy's people, who come to me with a recommendation and a conclusion that is based on engineering data, I probe the basis for their conclusion to assure that it is sound and that it is logical. I found this recommendation not to launch an SRM at a temperature below 53 degrees it came as somewhat of a surprise to me.
One of my colleagues that was in the meeting summed it up best. This was a meeting where the determination was to launch, and it was up to us to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was not safe to do so. This is in total reverse to what the position usually is in a pre-flight conversation or flight readiness review. It's usually exactly opposite that.
I assure you, sir, that there was no reversal of the tradition of NASA, which says prove to me why you can't fly versus prove to me why you can.
We've dealt with Marshall for a long time, and I've always been in the position of defending our position to make sure that we were ready to fly. And I guess I didn't realize until after that meeting and after several days that we had absolutely changed in a position from what we had been before. But that evening, it was, I guess I had never had those kinds of things come from the people at Marshall, that we had to prove to them that we weren't ready.
In other words, you honestly believe that you had a duty to prove that it would not work?
That's kind of the mode we got ourselves into that evening. It seems like we've always been in the opposite mode. I should have detected that, but I did not. But the roles kind of switched.
To me, that's it doesn't make any difference. If somebody has given me a recommendation and a conclusion that's based on engineering data, I'm going to understand the basis for that recommendation and conclusion to assure that it is logical. Now, I think that has been interpreted when one challenges someone who says, I don't have anything too qualitative, but I'm worried, that that's pressure. And I don't see it that way.
Then he finally finished his summary and said, it was his opinion that the data we presented was inconclusive. Think about that statement. NASA, since early spaceflight, forced us as contractors and themselves to prove that it was safe to fly. If it was his opinion that our data was inconclusive, then obviously we hadn't done that. And so, by default, that's really the third no vote. I believe our management felt the pressure because they called for a 5-minute offline caucus to reevaluate the data, and if they hadn't felt the pressure, there was no need for that caucus because the decision had already been made by us not to launch.
The resolve of the Thiokol managers to defend a position of acknowledged uncertainty was weakening. Magnifying the pressure may have been the fact that just 6 days earlier, NASA had announced that it was looking for a second source for the solid rocket boosters and had invited 4 competitors to bid on the project. Thiokol's exclusive contract with the agency, a contract worth over $1 billion, was in jeopardy. The Thiokol Caucus lasted not 5, but 30 minutes. When it was over, the managers reversed themselves and gave NASA the green light to launch, as the Presidential Commission concluded, in order to accommodate a major customer.
Now, it's my opinion that the caucus constitutes the unethical decision-making forum that evening. The first words spoken were by our general manager at the plant, and he said in a soft voice, we have to make a management decision. Now, I emphasize soft voice because he wasn't talking to me and my colleagues. He was talking to the other 3 senior executives in a room, all of whom were vice presidents. They started to have their own little meeting amongst themselves at the total exclusion of those that were sitting there, namely myself and my engineering colleagues. As they were conducting this meeting, my colleague Arnie Thompson jumped up, went down with a pad of paper, put it down in front of him, sketched out the joint, and started once again to create the dialogue as to what was wrong in launching in cold weather.
During the caucus, as Mr. Boisjoly have mentioned, something that I'm not usually accustomed to doing, and sitting down between 2 managers and trying one more time to explain and make sure that I got my thoughts across to them.
He was summarily ignored. got a very, very nasty look from the general manager, got up because he couldn't get anybody to listen, went back to his seat. I took 8 by 10 color glossy photographs that showed the massive hot gas blow-by the year before and a typical blow-by of a room temperature launch, which were like night and day. Placed them down in the table in front of the managers and literally screaming at the managers to look at the photos and not ignore what they were telling us. I was told later on by my colleagues that I was literally screaming at them. I couldn't engage them either. They just didn't want to hear. Looks like, go away and don't bother us with the facts. We're busy. I get the same looks as Arnie. I withdrew, took the photos back, and sat down. There was no way we could engage them in fruitful discussion. They continued to put things on a piece of paper that would justify a launch. And about halfway through this discussion, the general manager once again said in a soft voice, "Am I the only one who wants to launch?" Now think about that statement. I believe that that statement is a position of weakness. But because he didn't get any answer from his 3 colleagues, it became that he was speaking from a position of strength. And they continued to write down and discuss what they were going to put in on a piece of paper to justify a launch.
There was never one comment in favor, as I've said, of launching by any engineer or other non-management person in the room before or after the caucus.
We had no reason to take the risk of shooting at a O-ring temperature that was lower than the 53 degrees. And my recommendation in some of the former meetings was just merely to wait a day. Wait at least until the afternoon, and then depending on temperatures, perhaps waiting another day.
I did not agree with some of the statements that were being made to support the decision. I was never asked nor polled, and it was clearly a management decision from that point.
Earlier in testimony in private session, you indicated that Mr. Boisjoly and Mr. Thompson were the most knowledgeable on the seals. Is that correct?
Yes.
Then the 2 most knowledgeable engineers were still opposed, and my understanding is they were still strongly opposed. Why did you proceed in the light of your 2 experts being very strongly opposed?
I would say that we felt that although they were outspoken, we listened to their reasons more than the intensity. And the reasons boiled down to the things that I said. The reason was the uncertainty about the rapidity with which that primary would move. We did expect the primary to seat. We expected to seat because we had some tolerance on its ability to erode and still seat and seal. So that was our thought process. Now, the discussion was a free, open discussion with all of the people there, and I believe that it was not at that point it was clear to me we were not going to get a unanimous decision.
And they continued to write down and discuss what they were going to put in on a piece of paper to justify a launch. And just before they were going to take the vote poll, the general manager turns to the vice president of engineering, who was the last holdout, and said, "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat."
What did you have in mind when you asked him to take off his engineering hat and put on his management hat?
I had in mind the fact that we had identified that we could not quantify the movement of that primary, the time for movement of the primary. We didn't have the data to do that, and therefore it was going to take a judgment rather than a precise engineering calculation in order to conclude what we needed to conclude.
And I don't know if Roger was referring to me in his testimony, but he could have been, because I had the feeling that we were it was a distinct feeling that we were in the position of having to prove it was unsafe instead of the other way around, which was a totally new experience. The decision was to be made, and a poll was then taken. And I remember distinctly at the time whether I would have the courage, if asked, and I thought I might be, what I would do and whether I would be alone. I didn't think I'd be alone, but I was wondering if I'd have the courage. I remember that distinctly, to stand up and say no. However, we were not asked as the engineering people. It was a management decision at the vice president's level.
Then the vote poll was taken, and it was 4 votes to launch against none.
And we did conduct that poll, and then we did conclude that it was safe to launch.
Could you tell us what the poll showed? You say that you and Mr. Kilminster and Mr. Wiggins and Mr. Lund were unanimous. How about the others?
We only polled the management people because we had already established that we were not going to be unanimous.
And I felt there was nothing more to say, that we could change anything, and also felt in my mind that I didn't see, and I believe I mentioned this to you last week, that I didn't see a dangerous concern. I knew we were entering into increased risk, and I didn't feel comfortable doing that. I was nervous. You asked how I slept that night, and I said I thought I slept okay. My wife differed with that as I talked with her after that, but there was a nervousness there that we were increasing the risk, and I believe all of us knew that if it were increased to the level of an O-ring burn through, what the consequences would be, and I don't think there's any question in anyone's mind about that.
You mentioned earlier that you thought this decision on launching should be an engineering decision, not a program management decision. How would you characterize the final decision to launch from Thiokol? Was it engineering or was it management?
Well, I guess I'd have to characterize it as a management decision, the final decision.
Thank you.
Willing to ignore the input of its own experts, Thiokol goes back on the line at 11 p.m. and recommends now that the launch proceed.
I must emphasize, I had my say, and I never take any management right to take the input of an engineer and then make a decision based on that input. And I truly believe that. I've worked at a lot of companies, and that's been done from time to time, and I truly believe that. So there was no point in me doing anything any further. Once again, I must make a strong comment about the turn of events. I must emphasize that Thiokol management fully supported the decision not to launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit prior to the caucus. The caucus itself constituted the unethical decision-making forum resulting from customer intimidation. This is further underscored by NASA's immediate acceptance of the new decision for launch, which was consistent with their desires. And please note that no discussion of probing questions were asked.
In regard to the launch recommendation process, I continue to believe that the activities associated with this process, specifically the January 27th discussion between Thiokol and Marshall, were conducted in a thorough and professional manner in the NASA tradition with full and open participation of the personnel necessary for appropriate disposition of this specific concern. And I think one of my roles in that was to see that that was carried out. It was a problem being worked by the shuttle rocket booster, but I felt it was appropriate to see that that was carried out in that manner and made no indication of my feelings during the course of the discussions. At the end of the 2.5-hour period, including approximately 35-minute off-the-loop Thiokol Caucus, and after their recommendation, their final recommendation to launch, I collectively asked all Telecon parties if there were any disagreement with Thiokol's rationale and recommendation as stated by Mr. Kilminster. There were none received from Thiokol at Wasatch, Marshall at Huntsville, nor Mr. McDonald, who was sitting with Mr. Malloy and myself at KSC. Mr. Chairman, when I asked very clearly and very deliberately on the Telecon, while all parties were involved, I asked if there were any disagreements to all the parties, including Mr. McDonald, who was sitting right across from me, and there was no comment, no objection, or anything raised at that time.
Satisfied with Thiokol's new position, Reinartz, in an action unprecedented so close to a launch, asks Kilminster to put the recommendation in writing and fax it to Marshall and to Kennedy. The fateful Telecon is over. It is just after 11 p.m. While waiting for the written recommendation to arrive at Cape Kennedy, Thiokol's Al McDonald continues desperately to try and convince NASA officials Malloy and Reinhardt that the launch should be delayed. He raises two additional concerns: ice on the launch pad, which could damage the orbiter itself, and the potential loss of $22 million worth of boosters due to a storm brewing out in the recovery area.
I was told that, you know, these weren't really my problems, and I really shouldn't concern myself with these. But I said, you know, all three of these together should be more than sufficient to cancel the launch. If the one that we had discussed earlier wasn't. The NASA people were there said that, well, they would pass these on. They could tell I was disturbed, and they would pass those on as concerns, and that they would do it in an advisory capacity. And I don't know why NASA would ever launch below 40 degrees Fahrenheit if that's what the SRM was qualified to. In fact, I made the direct statement that if anything happened to this launch, told them I sure wouldn't want to be the person that had to stand in front of a board of inquiry to explain why I launched this outside of the qualification of the solid rocket motor or any shuttle system. When I made that statement, no one commented on that.
Frustrated at this point, McDonald retrieves the faxed recommendation and returns to the Telecon room, where he overhears Reinhardt and Malloy conferring with Level 2 Arnold Aldrich about the ice on the launch pad and the booster recovery issues. Although the Level 3 managers later deny it, McDonald assumes that his concerns about the O-rings had already been relayed.
Very familiar with the process by which these things are reviewed, and I was absolutely positive and sure that they were brought to their attention, because that's the way things go. I talked to the SRB project manager, I talked to his boss, the shuttle project manager, the shuttle project office, and I was sure that those all went through that review. I had no doubt in my mind that they had.
I did not discuss with Mr. Aldrich the conversations that we had just completed with Martin Thiokol.
Could you explain why?
Yes, sir. At that time, and I still consider it today, that was a Level 3 issue. Level 3 being an SRB element or an external tank element or a space shuttle main engine element or an orbiter. There was no violation of launch commit criteria. There was no waiver required, in my judgment at that time, and still today. And we worked many problems at the orbiter and the SRB and the external tank level that never get communicated to Mr. Aldrich or Mr. Moore. It was clearly a Level 3 issue that had been resolved.
Let me follow through on that, and I'm kind of aware of the launch decision process, and you said that you made the decision at your level on this thing. If this were an airplane, an airliner, and I just had a 2-hour argument with Boeing on whether the wing was going to fall off or not, I think I'd tell the pilot, at least mention it. Why didn't we escalate a decision this important?
I did, sir.
You did?
Yes, sir.
Tell me what levels above you knew.
As I stated earlier, Mr. Reinhardt, who is my manager, was at the meeting, and on the morning, about 5 o'clock, in the operations support room, where we all are, I informed Dr. Lucas of the
But Dr.
content
Lucas
of
is
the
not in
discussion.
the launch decision chain.
No, sir, he is not.
What was the highest level?
Mr. Reinhardt is in the launch decision chain.
Okay, and is he the highest level in that chain?
No.
Why?
Normally, it would go from me to Mr. Reinhardt to Mr. Aldrich to Mr. Moore.
Based on the results of the meeting and the conclusions out of the meeting, Mr. Malloy and I informed the Director of Marshall, Dr. Lucas, and the Director of Science and Engineering, Mr. Kingsbury, on the 28th of January about 5, of the initial Thiokol concerns and engineering recommendations, the final Thiokol launch recommendation, and the full support of the Marshall Engineering for the launch recommendation that I felt had led to a successful resolution of this concern.
Can I interrupt for a minute?
Yes, sir.
You informed Dr. Lucas he's not in a reporting chain. And
no, sir.
If I can use an analogy, if you want to report a fire, you don't go to the mayor. In his position as center director, Dr. Lucas was out of the reporting chain, much like a mayor. And if it was important enough to report to him, why didn't you go through the fire department and go up your decision chain?
Based on my assessment of the situation as dispositioned that evening, for better or worse, I did not perceive any clear requirement for interaction with level 2 as the concern was worked and dispositioned with full agreement among all responsible parties as to that agreement.
In the Navy, we used to have an expression about going by the book, and I gather you were going by the book. But doesn't the process require some judgment? Don't you have to use common sense? Wouldn't common sense require that you tell the decision makers about this serious problem that was different from anything in the past?
In looking at that one, Mr. Chairman, together with Mr. Malloy, when we looked at were there any launch commits, any level 2, as I perceived doing the Telecon, I got no disagreement concerning the Thiokol launch between any of the level 3 elements, the contractor, or Mr. McDonald there.
Would you have expected this problem to have been brought up to level 2?
Well, I will answer from my perspective. I think looking back on everything and the amount of discussion that went on, even though the people decided it was judgmental, they thought it had been put to bed, I would have thought it would have been brought to level 2, if you want my honest opinion.
Did you discuss with us at all the possibility of reporting it to Arnie Aldridge?
No, ma'am, I did not.
Did anyone recommend to you that you report it to
No.
Mr. Aldridge?
No, Dr. Wright, they did not.
Mr. Reinhardt, are you telling us that you, in fact, are the person who made the decision not to escalate this to a level 2 item?
That's correct, sir.
Thank you.
The chain of command chorus was also joined by George Hardy and Marshall Director William Lucas. Rogers, and you didn't convey the Thiokol concerns to Mr. Aldrich or to Mr. Moore? Hardy, that would not be my reporting channel.
You didn't tell, I gather, you didn't tell Mr. Aldrich or Mr. Moore what Mr. Reinhardt had told you.
No, sir, that is not the reporting channel. Mr. Reinhardt reports directly to Mr. Aldrich in this sense. Mr. Reinhardt informs me as the institutional manager of the progress he's making in implementing his program, but that I have never on any occasion reported to Mr. Aldrich.
And whether it was in the line of authority or not, you had ample opportunity to pass on the information that there'd been serious concern about this seal. And you had subsequent conversations with Mr. Moore and Mr. Aldrich prior to the flight, and you never mentioned what Mr. Reinhardt had told you.
No, sir, because I was shown a document signed by Mr. Kilminster that indicated that would not be significant, that the temperature would not be, that would be that much lower, as I recall it.
An argument could be made, maybe because of this piece of paper, that Mr. Reinhardt's lived up to the book, but there was no application, as far as you can tell, of common sense. I mean, this obviously was a very serious matter, and by insisting that this piece of paper was gave everybody the blessing of Thiokol.
That document, the final decision chart faxed by Morton Thiokol to NASA, based its recommendation on a critical and officially unacceptable assumption. If the primary does not seat, the secondary will.
There's nothing on this chart that supports the decision to launch. In the interest of time, I'm just going to short-circuit it, but they actually regurgitated the things that were in my charts and used them as reasons to launch. They talked about harder O-rings, taking longer to seat. Remember, it was timing function in my chart. They declared that if more gas get passed, then the primary would still seal. They also declared that if the primary didn't work, that the secondary would. I refer to these as magic wand tricks. You can't just declare things are going to work if they aren't designed properly and may not work.
Well, let's see, this goes back to that 1R1 discussion that we had. And what that boiled down to was that during the first 160 milliseconds, the joint is still closed enough that the secondary O-ring actually provides redundancy.
160 milliseconds, that joint is officially classified as a criticality 1R?
It's not officially, no ma'am.
That's right. It's just a criticality 1. So even during the first 160 milliseconds, you are not allowed to consider the secondary seal a backup to the primary seal by the critical items list.
Well, I don't certainly want to debate that point. What we did is what we considered.
That is a waiver to the requirement to have a redundant system. What this says is that if the primary seal does not seat, the secondary seal will. It says you have redundancy, and you have not shown that the primary won't function, but if it doesn't, the redundant system will still operate. That's the way I interpret that.
Mr. Malloy, let's try an analogy and see if you think it's an apt one. Let's suppose that you're a manager of a baseball team and you have an ace relief pitcher. But let's suppose that that person is injured, has a sore arm, so you put him on the disabled list. Then you can't say that if my starting pitcher gets into trouble in the 5th inning, I can bring in my ace reliever because he's not available to you by the rules. And it seems to me that's the situation with this waiver.
But what happened during that night was a whole series of events where constraints came up and were successively knocked down by the launch managers. There was a very interesting statement that was made in one of the press accounts by a unnamed NASA official down at the Kennedy Space Center that the whole situation that night was very strange, that it was clear that a decision had been made that this launch was a go, pretty much no matter what. And that's exactly what happened.
In the early morning hours of January 28th, an ice inspection team surveys the launch pad and is shocked to discover that it is covered with ice. One of the top ice engineers comments to a colleague, "Looks like a no-go today." Reached in California to be informed of the results of the ice team inspection, Rockwell Space Transportation Division President Rocco Petrone telephoned his representative at Kennedy.
The prime thing we were concerned with was the unknown baseline. We had not launched in conditions of that nature, and we just felt we had an unknown. And I then called my 2 program managers who were in Florida at 5:45, and they said, "We cannot recommend launching from here." I said, "Let's make sure we have the NASA understand that we, Rockwell, feel it's not safe to launch."
It is the last chance NASA will get to avert the tragedy. Glacier relays Petrone's concerns to Arnold Aldrich at Level 2.
I then gave the following recommendation to NASA, in which I said that Rockwell could not assure the safety of flight. My exact quote was, and it comes in 2 parts. The first one was Rockwell cannot 100% assure that it is safe to fly, which I quickly changed to Rockwell cannot assure that it is safe to fly. Now, this is the first time where we've been in a position where we really had no database from which to make a judgment. And this is the first time that Rockwell has taken a unsafe to fly position.
His statement to me, as best I can reconstruct it to report to you at this time, was that While he did not disagree with the analysis that JSC and KSC had reported that they could not give an unqualified go for launch, as ice on the launch complex was a condition which had not previously been experienced, and thus this posed a small additional but unquantifiable risk. Mr. Glazer did not ask or insist that we not launch, however. No other comments or recommendations were offered by the large group assembled with respect to concern for proceeding with the launch. At the conclusion of the above review, I felt reasonably confident that the launch should proceed.
After the disaster, Aldrich and Jesse Moore, the Associate Administrator for Space Flight, downplayed their personal responsibility for the launch decision by deflecting blame to the Level 3 managers and the Level 4 contractors for failing to bring critical information to their attention. Even though when such information had been brought forward, it was readily dismissed.
No, but I gather that's what Thiokol was saying. We think now that we should not launch, or at least the engineers did.
Yes, sir.
We don't think we should launch in this temperature. And Mr. Malloy, according to the testimony, said, well, you can't do that. You can't change the launch commitment criteria on the eve of launch. This is Friday night. You can't do that.
I'm not sure what he meant by that, and I think you'll have to ask him his intentions there and so forth. But as Gene said, there are launch commit criteria that are changed.
Well, we heard him yesterday. I think he's saying the same thing Mr. Ulrich does, except he as it turned out, Thiokol, however late in the game, apparently said we don't think we don't think the criteria is right. We think it would be dangerous to launch at this temperature. That was the first recommendation.
You certainly can raise objections to launch commit criteria. I mean, there's nothing in the program that says if someone has a problem with the launch commit criteria, until it's T-minus 0, you can raise an objection to it and so forth.
I would think it was more than reasonable that if someone were still concerned that this was a very bad judgment or a bad action to take, they would call me, and I left every opportunity for that to happen.
However, I would like to point out that there is nothing in the program that says if a contractor has any problems that he could not pick up the phone and call me or call Mr. Aldridge or get a message to a particular concern.
Although the launch pad ice did not contribute directly to the destruction of the Challenger, the Presidential Commission concluded that, however ambiguous Rockwell's position was, it is clear that they did tell NASA that the ice was an unknown condition. Under the circumstances the Commission charged, NASA appeared to be requiring Rockwell to prove that it was not safe to launch rather than proving it was safe. The decision to launch under such circumstances was, at best, questionable.
You know, that was another one of these strange factors that was different from previous launches. That just kind of adds up to the total impression that NASA, on this particular occasion, broke so many rules that you've got to search for an underlying explanation of why they did that. You also find in the records a number of statements by public affairs people that there were phone calls in connection with the State of the Union address, where the President was going to make reference to the shuttle and the teacher in space during his speech that night before Congress. What these people deny is that these phone calls are reflective of pressure coming from the White House to launch. The reason that NASA proceeded to launch was that the White House told them to. And I have been told by one eyewitness source that the decision was made by the President of the United States to proceed with the launch in the face of what the President was told were cold weather concerns because they wanted to get the shuttle in the air in connection with the publicity for the Teacher in Space program. And that's where the impetus came from.
The final chance to delay the mission had failed. Challenger would be launched just a few hours later at 11:38 a.m.
I have polled the technical community, and you will have our consensus to proceed with this launch. Good luck and Godspeed.
burn almost all the way through, and then maybe somebody with authority and courage would have enough fortitude to stand up and stop the flights until we fixed the joints. It was about 5 minutes before the launch, as I was walking past the room normally used to view the launches, when a colleague of mine, Bob Ebling, encouraged me to step in and watch. At first I declined because I had made up my mind not to watch this launch.
Boisjoly joined Bob Ebling and others to watch the launch.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
As the vehicle ignited and started to clear the launch tower, I whispered to Bob that we had just dodged a bullet.
Engine's beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%.
About 60 seconds into the launch, Bob whispered back to me that he had just completed a prayer of thanks to the Lord for a successful launch.
3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
One minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
We all sat in stunned silence for a short time. Then I left the room and went directly to my office, where I remained in shock the rest of the day, just staring at the walls. I was paid a visit by 2 of my SEAL task force colleagues who inquired as to my condition. And I just was able to shake my head and speak and nod to them that I was okay, because I was unable to speak for fear of just totally breaking down.
Flight GC, we've had negative contact, lost downlink.
Okay, all operators, watch your data carefully. All operators, contingency procedures in effect.
Flight Fido.
Go ahead.
RSO reports vehicle exploded.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
I will never forget, and I hope this nation will never forget, especially the engineering management community, the supreme sacrifice that the 7 Challenger astronauts paid by forfeiting their lives for such an irresponsible launch decision. May we always remember astronauts Onizuka, McAuliffe, Jarvis, Resnick, McNair, Scobie, and Smith for their courage and dedication to this nation's space program.
This would be also for Dr. Graham. I've been told that Rockwell saw the pictures of the ice at Pad 39B yesterday and was concerned enough about those pictures to call NASA and ask for a delay in the launch. Did you receive such a call, and if so, why was it not acted on?
Let me defer that question to Jesse Moore and to Dick Smith, who were both here at the launch pad at that time.
The technical team did sit down, all the NASA people involved as well as the contract people involved, and did feel that the conditions at the launch pad were acceptable for launch, and basically recommended that we launch.
This terrible accident that's occurred was completely unexpected and, of course, completely unanticipated, and therefore we'll have to go back and review the entire range of NASA plans and activities.
We have been meeting almost continuously since yesterday morning and forming a number of different teams. And our objective in the formation
of these teams is to make sure that all aspects of the flight, from a data gathering point of view, from an impoundment point of view, are protected, so that we can then, in fact, put the technical people in place to go through this type of data in a very, very systematic, professional, and thorough manner.
What really happened to us right after the disaster was that Arnie Thompson and I were placed on the failure investigation team and sent to the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. And what I saw made me very angry, because NASA management was diligently attempting to shape the investigation and find something other than low temperature that caused the disaster. And it was really a terrible scene from that standpoint.
Today we do not have any specific areas at this time. We made a cursory look. Did we see anything anomalous with any of the hardware that comes off at T0 yesterday afternoon? That showed nothing.
NASA knew about the black puff of smoke the next day and knew for sure that the joint had leaked on ignition because it was witnessed by that black puff of smoke on film. And yet we who were on the team were not told about it. And they were chasing us down blind alley after blind alley trying to find something other than low temperature so they could blame that disaster on it.
At some point, I gather, you will agree that the colder the weather, the greater the risk. Is that accurate? Do you think that at some point, the coldness of the weather makes a difference on the risk?
Well, I'm sure there must be some point, because there's some point at which the structural integrity of the O-rings wouldn't be maintained. So we're not starting to approach that.
At what point would that be?
I think that'd be somewhere in the minus 40, minus 50.
So that insofar as you're concerned now, it wouldn't make any difference about the risks in connection with the joints if it was above 40 below.
NASA doesn't like to admit it was wrong, and they tried as long and as hard as possible to stick with that erroneous accident. They were reluctant to admit what really happened. Some NASA people are still reluctant to admit what happened.
There's another interesting piece of evidence. Congressman Bill Nelson recently published a book about his experience with the space program, and he states there quite explicitly that prior to the launch, the head of the astronaut program, who was at the Cape, queried NASA launch officials and asked specifically, did Rocco Petrone approve this launch? They by no means approved the launch, and Rocco Petrone never made any statements approving the launch. Quite the contrary. His statements of concern were probably more pointed than the ones that were actually delivered in the ICE meetings at Kennedy. According to Bill Nelson, the astronaut chief was told, yes, Rocco approved the launch. And Nelson himself states that the astronauts in that particular instance were lied to. After the accident, NASA set up an investigating panel to begin to look at what had caused the disaster. There were statements made publicly by NASA officials during those first hours and days that they had no idea what had caused the problem, and that everything possible was going to be examined to determine the cause.
Upset that NASA management was concealing its knowledge of the O-ring problems from the Commission, NASA budget analyst Richard Cook, who had warned headquarters the previous July that the seals were malfunctioning and that a failure in flight would be catastrophic, sent a detailed 3-page memo to his superior on Monday, February 3rd, in which he documented the agency's long-standing awareness of the erosion issue.
I started off the memo by saying that there is a growing consensus that the cause of the Challenger explosion was a burn-through at a field joint in a solid rocket booster. And that was, in fact, what the engineers at headquarters were realizing and confirming, even though I must say that the NASA officials down at the Kennedy Space Center knew of this much earlier. In fact, I'm convinced by the time the afternoon press conference convened after the accident, NASA then knew it had been a solid rocket booster burn-through. But I wanted to point out in this that by February 3rd there was a consensus at headquarters also that this is what had happened. And I also said that it was a consensus that if a burn-through occurred, it had probably been a preventable accident and that the shuttle had been flying in an unsafe condition for over a year. Now, when I wrote this, I left it with my superior, who was, it wasn't Mr. Mann, it was another fellow who was actually like a team leader. And he came back to me with this and said, "This is explosive. Who have you given this to?" And I told him, well, I'd left a couple copies for a couple other people, and he wanted them, and I went and retrieved the copies and gave them to him. So essentially, as far as he was concerned, this was not going anywhere.
That same day, President Reagan, following the advice of his Chief of Staff, Donald Regan, and others, announced the appointment of his own team to manage the investigation.
It's time now to assemble a group of distinguished Americans to take a hard look at the accident, to make a calm and deliberate assessment of the facts and ways to avoid repetition. So I am today announcing the formation of a presidential commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger's accident. The commission will review the circumstances surrounding the accident, determine the probable causes, and develop recommendations for corrective action. And this commission will report back to me within 120 days. William P. Rogers, former Secretary of State and former Attorney General, will serve as chairman of the commission, and Neil Armstrong, former astronaut, will serve as its vice chairman. In addition, today we are announcing 10 of its members drawn from distinguished leaders of the government, scientific, technical, and management communities.
On the other hand, we are not going to conduct this investigation in a manner which would be unfairly critical of NASA, because I certainly think NASA has done an excellent job, and I think the American people do.
From my own point of view, having what I believe is convincing information that the decision to launch Challenger was made by the President, my own opinion is that the commission was created to cover that up and to assure that as the investigation moved along, it wasn't going to get too close to the White House involvement. And if you look at the whole history of the commission, you see very clearly two things. One, they always steered the deliberations and the discussions to the technical cause of the problem, that is the O-ring joint and the other technical issues. And two, the only time any information was brought out that was in any way detrimental to NASA or that discussed the circumstances of the launch was when some employee or whistleblower or engineer or whoever brought it up or got it into the press or made it clear that the story was not as it was being told publicly.
The first commission hearing was held behind closed doors on Thursday, February 6th, where NASA officials again reiterated that they had no clue as to what might have gone wrong.
Judson Lovingood, the deputy manager of shuttle projects at Marshall, under Stanley Reinhartz, for example, testified during the first hearing that NASA had never seen any erosion of a secondary seal, when it was precisely such an event that had precipitated the top-level briefing at NASA headquarters the August before. And in an astounding and masterful omission of essential details, he also told the commission that although Thiokol had expressed some concerns about the cold on the afternoon of the 27th, they ultimately recommended that it was okay to launch. In other words, no reference to Thiokol's objections whatsoever. And this from the fellow who, when he was in that situation just 1 week earlier, had suggested to his superior, Reinhartz, that higher-ups be notified of Thiokol's concerns and the corresponding likelihood of another launch delay.
The week after the launch, it was becoming clear from the statements that NASA officials were making publicly that a cover-up was underway and that the public was not going to hear the history of the O-rings and what problems there had been in the very widespread knowledge that NASA had that it was a dangerous situation.
Determined to bring the truth to light, Cook gathered up all of his documentation, including his explosive February 3rd memo, and decided to share it directly with the Presidential Commission.
And I said to them that I hope that people who bring information out on this were not going to be subjected to retribution, because I felt that the Presidential Commission was a channel, the appropriate channel for information to get out. And I was told by the person I talked to that don't worry, NASA was going to be pretty much protected in all this, and that I shouldn't be concerned. Now,
Cook had apparently been misinterpreted. While he was concerned about any potential retribution directed against him, the Commission representative thought he meant the political repercussions for the space agency. Refusing to be discouraged, Cook opted for a different approach to bring the unsettling truth to light.
So my wife and I discussed this, and we felt, well, you've got to go to the press. That's the only channel for this information to be made public. So I took the papers down to the New York Times, and through a very lengthy series of discussions with them, because they didn't understand what I was talking about, explained the whole situation.
The resulting front-page story in the Sunday New York Times on February 9th rocked both NASA and the Presidential Commission. Cook's anonymous leak provided the public with the first detailed analysis of how the O-ring joints functioned and how they failed.
The Commission then had a closed meeting on Monday, the 10th of February, to decide what to do about all this. And if you read the transcript, now some of the sections of the transcript have been deleted. I have copies of those, which people have given me, but essentially what the Commission was saying was, how are you, in public session tomorrow, going to explain this O-ring history so it doesn't look like you knew there was a problem? They even counseled NASA officials on what to say. You know, you should make it look like this and make it look like that. And in other words, it was a session designed of what NASA and the Commission was going to do in public to cover themselves.
During the same closed-door session, awareness of Thiokol's original no-launch recommendation also came to light. It very nearly didn't. Professor Mark Maier explains what happened during the session.
The February 10th session was really a turning point in the presidential investigation for a lot of reasons. Malloy, whom NASA had designated to lead the technical briefing before the Commission, had just finished explaining how the clevis tang opening, quote, allows flow to impinge on the O-ring before it can be sealed, even though, as Malloy well knew, these seals were never supposed to be exposed to heat of this magnitude. And he also led the Commission to believe that the O-ring seal was designed to seal by extrusion, when the extrusion had been a documented source of concern to NASA engineers all the way back to 1979 and even 1977. His description of the evening telecon was similarly disingenuous, and I'm going to quote now from the Presidential Commission closed-door testimony. Thiokol presented to us the fact that the lowest temperature that we had flown an O-ring or a case joint was 53 degrees, and they wanted to point out that we would be outside of that experience base. After hearing the discussion, we all concluded that there was no problem with the predicted temperatures for the solid rocket motor, and I received a document from the solid rocket motor project manager at Thiokol to that effect, that there were no adverse consequences expected due to the temperatures on the night of the 27th. In other words, again, no reference whatsoever to the fact that Thiokol had objected to the launch. At this point, the Commission, which was meeting in the hot and stuffy old executive office building in Washington, was just about ready to call it a day. As Commissioner Holtz told me, Rogers was literally preparing to adjourn the meeting when some activity and whispering began around Larry Malloy. According to Holtz, Malloy got Rogers' attention and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, but I believe Al McDonald of Morton Thiokol wanted to make another point." McDonald had been sitting behind Malloy all this time. It had obviously become clear to McDonald by now that no one from Marshall was about to volunteer any details concerning the evening telecon. So McDonald took it upon himself and dropped the bombshell, revealing that Thiokol had originally officially recommended not launching below 53 degrees. It took a while for the full impact to dawn on the commission, and if you read the transcript from the closed-door testimony, you can see things like Chairman Rogers saying things like, "I'm not sure I understand. Am I hearing you say that you had a meeting and you initially recommended against the launch?" It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, Cook's leak to the New York Times, which won the reporter Philip Boffey a share of the Pulitzer Prize in journalism that year, and McDonald's testimony really became the turning point in the investigation.
Reeling from the double-barreled combination, NASA and the Commission had no choice but to confront the uncomfortable truth. The Commission, which had expected to focus narrowly on only the technical cause of the disaster, now had to address the decision-making process itself.
Commissioner Holtz told me that the reaction of the Commission was, "Oh shit, this is going to be worse than we thought." At the same time, the Thiokol Telecon would essentially provide NASA higher-ups with a convenient cover to escape close scrutiny for their contributions to the sequence of events, which only culminated in the disaster, especially the headquarters decision in August to fly the flawed joint as is and then fix it as they went along. We just need to remember, as Paul Shrivastava, a crisis management expert and a close colleague of mine, says, that crises are not, as commonly assumed, discrete events. They are processes. It's no surprise that in my field we often refer to large-scale bureaucracies only half-jokingly as vast systems of organized irresponsibility.
The Commission would eventually zero in on Thiokol management and NASA's middle-level managers, Larry Malloy in particular, to bear the brunt for the flawed decision. The next day would be the first public hearing on the Challenger disaster.
By Tuesday, February 11th, the commissioners, one, had been informed that the lack of a good secondary seal in the field joint was the top concern raised at a critical August briefing at NASA headquarters, and yet they decided that it was safe to continue flying. Two, the commission had also heard NASA officials from all levels represent the criticality 1 joint as if it were a redundant system. I think this was a difficult time for them. They were in the early stages of the investigation. They were trying to fathom the complexities that they were being swamped with. I think that made them understandably vulnerable and also willing to initially accepting all the official testimony at face value.
They invent acronyms for everything, and you really need a code book to understand what they're talking about. And this, again, is a form of deception.
That local ambient temperature will be in a tank condition. It will be below the general ambient because of the effects of the cryogens in the external tank and the heat short that exists through the attachments to the SRB and the wind blowing the cold air around the SRB.
They had also heard top NASA officials gloss over or conveniently omit any reference to the serious concerns related to the cold temperature which had been brought to their attention by either Thiokol or Rockwell. In fact, they had categorically denied that the cold temperatures had anything to do with the disaster until Presidential Commissioner and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman performed a simple experiment. What he did was take some of the rubber O-ring material and put it in ice under pressure, like this. He left it there for a while, and when he took it out, he confronted the managers with the fact that, as he put it, it doesn't stretch back. It stays the same dimension. For a few seconds at least, and more seconds than that, there is no resilience in this particular material when it is at a temperature of 32 degrees.
Well, when he did that, he removed from NASA management all the technicalese that they were trying to, skirt around and confuse the public and the press with. And they were very angry behind the scenes with that man because he made something very simple that they were trying to make very difficult in the explanation to the press and the public.
So that morning, the morning of the 9th, of the 11th rather, my boss, Mike Mann, took me over to Jesse Moore's office because he said Jesse wanted to know how I felt about all this. We got in there, and I said to Jesse, everything that has happened is going to come out. And Jesse said, yes, it will. And that was about all that was said. And they took me downstairs and put me in a government car and drove me over to the State Department. And I gradually realized that I was going to have to appear in public. And I went into a little anteroom, and in there were a number of NASA managers and commission members sitting around reading the newspaper and chit-chatting. And I was then taken out into the auditorium, where I heard for the first time Chairman Rogers say, "And we will be hearing from Mr. Cook this morning." A NASA engineer I knew told me privately there in the auditorium I had been set up, and to be careful.
On the day before Cook testified, Michael Weeks, the Deputy Associate Administrator for Space Flight at NASA, described him to the Commission as a, quote, financial type person and not too knowledgeable of the whole program situation. And referring to Cook's July memo, added that, quote, this is a less clinical analysis of the whole situation because this young chap came aboard the first thing of July and was, quote, just picking things up in a hallway. This was an obvious attempt to undermine Cook's credibility. It was only after intense questioning by Commissioner Holtz that Weeks eventually conceded that Cook's analysis was, in fact, substantially accurate.
Now it was Cook's turn to take the stand. In stark contrast to the deference and respect accorded the NASA managers, Chairman Rogers assumed an adversarial role with Cook. Although he would later apologize privately for doing so, Rogers treated him like a hostile witness, rather than dispassionately pursuing the substance of his concerns.
You didn't, I assume, make any attempt to weigh budgetary considerations and safety considerations, did you?
Not at all.
You weren't qualified for that?
No, sir.
And you assumed other people were doing that?
Yes.
So you don't now, and you never have, said that you distrusted or were unable to rely on those people who were primarily responsible for safety features?
Not at all. No, I didn't. In fact...
So, well, let me, if you don't mind,
yes, sir.
I promise you I'll give you plenty
Sure.
of chances. And you didn't feel that you were in a position, or should you, make those decisions about what should be done with the space program?
That's right. In fact...
So, so that the memo, which has been given a great deal of attention, sort of suggests that you were taking issue with the people who were highly qualified to make those judgments, where in fact you weren't at all. You were looking to see how much it might cost if certain changes had to be made. Is that right?
That's right. In fact, the morning of the hearing, when my boss took me over to get ready to go to meet the commission, he asked me, did you leak this stuff to the press? Now, up until then, I didn't know what I was going to say when I asked that question, and I found myself saying no. And he said, well, I'm surprised to hear that. I had been really angry at you, and frankly, they're now trying to find out who did. So I'd pretty much crossed the Rubicon on that one, and when I got over to face the commission, I realized that for my own safety and career and livelihood, that I pretty much was going to have to play the role of the rather innocent budget analyst, and that's what I tried to do.
So you were not involved in the publication of the document yourself?
No, I was not passing that around at
Since
all.
the accident, have you written another memorandum in connection with the accident?
Yes, I did.
What prompted that?
The heat of the moment. I think that the Commission and NASA was trying to destroy my credibility, destroy the credibility of the papers that had appeared in the New York Times, regardless of what effect that might have had on me personally or on my career. You know, trying to think back about what my reaction was during that hearing, it was fear. I guess there was some anger there at what these famous high-placed people were doing, but it was a setup. And it was a clear attempt by the Commission and by Chairman Rogers and by NASA to discredit me and to, by destroying my credibility, to get them off the hook for the O-ring documents that appeared in the press. The O-ring problem needed to be taken care of before we could look at the shuttle program as being completely resolved. And we had some other major budgetary issues that came up in that connection. For instance,
You still were doing it in terms of the budget? I mean, was that the purpose of writing the memorandum after the accident?
yes.
Did you have reason to think that efforts would not be made after the accident to investigate it thoroughly?
No. In fact, I knew that, that across the street, they were doing the same analyses we were doing.
Then would you explain again why you wrote the memorandum?
To document what I felt were all of the budgetary implications of the situation.
Only budgetary. Was there any other purpose? Well, if you'd rather not answer, it's all right. I'm curious about why you wrote the memorandum. It doesn't sound as if you had budgetary considerations in mind. It sounds differently. But...
Remember, my father called my wife, Phyllis, and asked her, he'd heard I was going to go on television in a hearing. And he said, "What are they doing to him?" And she said, "Well, you should be asking, what is he doing to them? Because I think that anyone who saw that hearing, and I know I was told this later by people up in Congress who've been watching it, realized that there was a very rotten fish in this whole situation. And I feel that from the 11th on, the Commission was backpedaling very rapidly, and that once the Thiokol engineers began to talk, and particularly after Al McDonald gave an interview to the New York Times where he told the whole story of the night before from where he was down at Kennedy, the Commission then realized that, hey, if they stick with these guys, we're sunk. And so they began to say publicly that there was a flaw in the launch decision. And from then, it was a whole different story. And the whole Thiokol thing began to fall into place.
The next significant event in the investigation occurred 3 days later, on February 14, 1986. Having heard of the Thiokol Telecon, the Commission brought all the key participants together for a closed-door hearing at the Kennedy Space Center.
Then we went down to testify, and the company, Morton Thiokol, gave me about 2 hours' notice that this was going to happen. And as I boarded the company jet, go down to Kennedy Space Center, we arrived in the attorney's brief. That's the night before that first closed-door hearing, and we were under instructions from the attorneys to answer all questions either yes or no and volunteer nothing. And, of course, I wasn't about to do that, and I wasn't there for that purpose, and so I kind of made a comment to one of the attorneys. Do you mean that I shouldn't tell the Presidential Commission about the general manager telling Bob Lund to take off his engineering hat and to put on his management hat? And when I said that, the attorney just about fell off his chair, because I think that was the first hint that we were going to tell all, at least I was. And we went into that closed-door hearing the next morning, and Morton Thiokol and NASA management got their chance to tell the Presidential Commission their side and their version of what happened the night before the launch. And they had beautiful publication-type documentation with colored view graphs and everything just absolutely perfect. And what we had was little 3x5 cards with scribbled notes on them, and we went in front of the Commission with those types of things. At least I did.
That's you and who else?
I spoke first from my 3x5 cards and gave my assessment of that telecon. Then I was followed by Arnie Thompson, and he verified what I had said was so and then added some more information. Then we were followed by Al McDonald, who gave his versions of what happened from his position at the Cape. After we got through giving that information, we were all asked to leave the room, and Presidential Commission members locked the door and placed a call directly to President Reagan, because what they had just heard was so unbelievable that they did not want the president being blindsided, and they were sure that the information would leak out to the press. They heard the whole scenario of what had taken place in the Telecon meeting the night before the launch. They heard the fact that the engineers opposed the launch. They heard Morton Thiokol name me as the most knowledgeable person and experienced person in the joints, followed by Ernie Thompson, followed by our boss. And Chairman Rogers was very angry when he asked him if the two top guys in the company recommended not to launch, why did you go against their recommendation and launch? It was not like you had the people at the bottom end of the experience ladder. You were talking to who you just told me were the two most experienced people in the company about these joints.
Boisjoly and his colleagues would be asked to repeat their testimony in public session on February 25th. His resolve to tell the truth would ultimately cost him his career at Thiokol.
Actually, we were boarded back on the company jet, and we flew back to the Marshall Space Flight Center, and I don't think there were 10 words spoken in the whole flight. And I offloaded and caught a commercial flight back home for some R&R. And then several weeks later, we were asked to testify to the Presidential Commission in public, which was basically a repeat of what we had stated in closed-door testimony. After that testimony, in which I directly rebutted our general manager's testimony about the engineer's supposedly non-unanimous position at the Telecon, I fell into further disfavor with the company and basically was sent home and off the failure investigation team. And I should tell you, before that, squashed between the first closed-door hearing and the public hearing, there was a two-Presidential Commission member meeting with some of us at the Marshall Space Flight Center. It was at that meeting that I handed a packet of memos and activity reports to the Presidential Commission, which ensured that they knew the condition of the management organizational structure prior to 6 months, at least, prior to the Challenger disaster.
Soon after my testimony, the Thiokol story began to get out, because what happened was that General Katina went down to Marshall and began to investigate the O-ring problem. And at that time, as I understand it, he got hold of some of the memos that Roger Boisjoly and some of the other engineers had been writing, and they really began to realize then that there was a very major problem in terms of what NASA had done, and there very quickly became a major problem in terms of the Commission's credibility and of what the Commission was going to do.
And I was told by a Presidential Commission member, if I had not handed that packet in, that they would have never looked at the organizational misconduct or the organizational structure at either NASA or Morton Thiokol, because their focus was on determining the technical cause of the disaster.
The experiences of Roger Boisjoly and Richard Cook remind us that acting in accord with our conscience and maintaining our dignity and self-respect in organizations is not always easy. Nonetheless, if their stories teach us anything, it is that although the cost of integrity may sometimes be high, its value is priceless.
And people were starting to look down upon myself and those of us that testified as troublemakers and causing the company great demise. And what they did is went through a subjective series of thought processes that felt that we were jeopardizing their jobs and their ability to earn a living and blaming us for it, when they should have been blaming the company, because it was those of us that testified that tried to stop the launch and the company that made the decision that put them in that situation, not us. And so we were feeling the wrath. In my town, for instance, people more or less gave us a silent treatment. At the company, when we walked down the corridors, people who we used to deal with on a daily basis used to turn away, and so they wouldn't be seen with us. And things like that hurt on a daily basis. The company was telling me to my face how important I was in a redesign, when in fact they had given the official orders to keep me isolated from NASA in the redesign. I was providing technical information and input to them, which they were using at meetings which I never was invited to, never knew they had happened, and never got any feedback. And so they indeed had isolated me. And so we were called back in front of the Presidential Commission, Al McDonnell and I, on May 1st, and asked by the chairman what our job assignments were. We told him how we've been treated, and he was visibly upset because we were being punished for honesty in our testimony. And as a result of that, the CEO commented to Al McDonald and myself and the other three, Brian Russell, Arnie Thompson, and Bob Ebling, in a closed meeting that we held in May, that up until that time the company was doing just fine. But when Al and I testified to the Presidential Commission about our treatment at the company, that caused the company more harm than all the releases up to that date. And so basically we fell into further disfavor. And it just became very difficult on a day-to-day basis.
By September of 1986, Boisjoly had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and went on long-term disability leave.
My disability provided 60% of my former salary and ended in January 1989. And at that point in juncture, I tried to re-enter my profession and found that I was blackballed. Having prepared for that eventuality, I took my professional engineering exams in October of 1988 and was notified in February of '89 that I had passed both exams. I am now a registered professional engineer and starting my own consulting business so that I can put my life back together, get my career started again, independent of industry, and show people at large that a person can go through a living hell like this for 3 years, recover, and become strong, and put the pieces back together. And I hope that will allow other people to see that if they get caught up in a situation like that, that they may also have the ability to do the same as I did.
Like Boisjoly, Richard Cook also left his employer, NASA, but for reasons which actually preceded the Challenger disaster.
I had decided to leave NASA a few weeks after I arrived. I'd gone to work for the government back in 1970, so I'd had a lot of analytical experience at several government agencies. I'd gone out of the government for a period of time and ended up working for a defense contractor, and then was given a job offer by NASA in the summer of 1985. But I felt pretty quickly that this was not going to work out the way I had wanted it to, because for one thing, there was a very great demand for a lot of unpaid overtime. And I felt that the pressure was coming not necessarily because you had to get the work done, but you had to show what a dedicated employee you were. And I think NASA, more than maybe any other agency I know, almost consumes you in terms of your whole life. And the people who really got ahead where I was were the bachelors or the unmarried people who could put in these long hours and make themselves look like they were really very dedicated people. I just didn't like that kind of atmosphere. And so I decided to get out. I applied for a number of jobs, and fortunately I had gotten an offer before Challenger blew up. And I made darn sure that that offer was firm before I began to go public with some of this stuff. Essentially, the Rogers Commission had failed on 3 different counts, and one is not holding NASA's top officials responsible for failing to act in terms of the long history of O-ring problems and dealing with that properly. Second, never determining who was really responsible for the decision to override Morton Thiokol's objections. And thirdly, not asking the question of why NASA officials behaved so differently on that particular launch than they had before.
It had been rumored during the investigation, at least, that there was a call either placed by the president or president cabinet level type officer to the Cape, creating the pressure to launch. You can also make a case for NASA wanting to see themselves in the State of the Union address.
I feel the White House was the body, the place that decided to proceed with the launch, that the Rogers Commission was put into place to cover that up, And that's why NASA officials acted so differently, because they got orders from above and they were going to launch this thing no matter what.
When you come to a point like we were faced with, you have three choices, and they're written up in a book entitled Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And of course, the exit means you just leave the job and you leave the confrontation behind you. Voice means you confront it and you voice your opinion and fight for a change. And loyalty means that you simply capitulate and don't do anything and stay within the misconduct of the system that's going on. And those are the three choices, and they're very high choices.
We asked Roger Boisjoly whether, knowing what he knows now, he would do it all over again. Roger Boisjoly.
Well, I had planned to retire at Morton Thiokol, and I was well along my career in my last job when this event confronted itself in front of me, and I basically have sacrificed my career, my ability to stay in the part of the country that I had chosen, and it's just turned my whole life upside down. But I have to tell you that the experience that I have experienced has made me a stronger person, and that given the same circumstances or typical circumstances in a similar manner, I do it exactly the same way.
Part of Boisjoly's response to Challenger was to lecture widely to business and university audiences about the importance of ethical decision-making, often at no expense except his travel and lodging costs.
I go through and tell them how to spot real trouble, and I define real trouble as that condition which exists in a company where the technical people spot that something is wrong with a product, and somebody, end user, could get either seriously hurt or killed. And they bring that information to company management, but management dismisses it as simply a nuisance. And so I tell them the first thing to do, that they should do, is get co-legal support for their position and voice it up through their management structure. If that doesn't work, get it in a form of a position letter. And if that doesn't work, now they're at the point of individual decision making where they have to face the choice of exit, voice, or loyalty.
I think that you really have to look very deeply in and see if your integrity is at stake, and if it is at stake, and if you feel you've been backed into a corner where you really, the only thing you can do and still live with yourself is to face up to this situation and take a stand, then I think you have to do it. However, if you do that, I think, and this went through my mind many times, if you're going to hit hard, gather all your resources, gather all the support you can, gather the friends you need to support you, and don't be half-hearted or timid about it. Don't go beyond your information, what you know, what you can defend, but don't hesitate once you've crossed that line and made that decision. You've got to go at them with all you have, because that's the only way I think you're going to come out of it intact.
Once you've dug into the story behind the Challenger disaster, I guess the overriding lesson that stands out is that the features which characterize the organizational behavior of NASA, of Morton Thiokol, and the other organizations, the pressures which led to the tragic and final decision to launch, they're virtually universal in hierarchical systems. In essence, this is ultimately not about Challenger or NASA or Morton Thiokol for that matter. It's really about my organization or your organization, and what we need to do to make all organizations more effective and ethical. It's natural to come to this point of our understanding about Challenger, an event which all of us shared, one which all of us were hurt by in some way, perhaps feeling a need to blame it on somebody. After all, Thiokol blamed NASA, NASA tried to blame Thiokol, Rockwell blamed NASA, NASA blamed Rockwell, subordinates blamed superiors, superiors blamed subordinates, and of course the Commission blamed the decision-making process. Perhaps this impulse to blame is only human. So then who would we blame? None of the individuals that we might single out could be considered stupid or evil. Each of the principals involved in this case was profoundly affected by the cultural, structural, or politicized elements of the organizations in which they worked. They and we are not immune to these influences. Therefore, I think we should hesitate before concluding that the fate of Challenger could simply have been averted by replacing the existing cast with a different set of actors chosen for the same roles under the same conditions. You can't emphasize the importance of rules, procedures, proper channels on the one hand, and then simultaneously condemn people for abiding by them. You can't have it both ways. This is clearly not to say that the system is always to blame and that individuals are blameless, but that individual choices and structural conditions are interactive. There's a favorite story of mine that I use in my teaching whose moral is, what you like to hear isn't always what you need to know. And I think that's a lot of what was happening in the case of the Challenger. We need to remember that individual behaviors are systematically shaped by organizational cultures and structures. And if you want people to communicate, to act responsibly, to use good judgment, to challenge and confront you, whether it's in business, in school, or even in personal life, then relationships have to be organized in a manner which allows, I would even say encourages that to happen. After all, it's ultimately not organizations or systems that make decisions, it is people, just as it is people who construct and maintain those systems. And where those systems are dysfunctional, as clearly they were here in this case, even if we are not to blame for their creation, it becomes our responsibility to change them for the better. Enabling or empowering environments can be constructed to ensure that the messenger with bad news doesn't always get shot, to ensure that dissent isn't immediately equated with disloyalty. I think that, at least to me, that's the challenge of Challenger. That, to me, is the real legacy of Mission 51L.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control. Roger, roll, Challenger.
They'd been launching spacecraft for 20 years, and I don't think they believed that they were going to blow one up.
They asked what Thiokol's position was, and I looked around the room, and I was a senior person, and I said, I don't want to fly. Looks to me, the story says that 53 degrees is about it. And, of course, you've heard the story of what happened after that.
This was a rather surprising conclusion based on data that didn't seem to hang together. So I challenged that.
And I remember distinctly at the time whether I would have the courage if asked, and I thought I might be, what I would do and whether I would be alone. I didn't think I'd be alone, but I was wondering if I'd have the courage. I remember that distinctly, to stand up and say no.
We only polled the management people because we had already established that we were not going to be unanimous.
The controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
I will never forget, and I hope this nation will never forget, especially the engineering management community, the supreme sacrifice that the 7 Challenger astronauts paid by forfeiting their lives for such an irresponsible launch decision. May we always remember astronauts Onizuka, McAuliffe, Jarvis, Resnick, McNair, Scobie, and Smith for their courage and dedication to this nation's space program.